If I'd known that joining a bowling league would be the start of unraveling my marriage, I might have stuck to Netflix and beer at home. But hindsight is 2020, and my time in the league quickly taught me two things. My bowling skills were trash, and some men can't keep their mouths shut about their extracurricular activities. If only I could have rolled my suspicions into the gutter like my ball that night. It started innocently enough. My wife, Madison, had been talking up this new coworker, Brandon, for months. She described him as funny and the life of the office. Apparently, he'd also been the driving force behind their department's weekly bowling league. One day, she casually suggested I join the league. "You're always talking about wanting to meet new people," she said. Madison's smile was sweet, her tone persuasive, and honestly, the idea seemed harmless. I'd always been a little envious of how easily she clicked with people. Joining wasn't difficult. Brandon welcomed me like we'd been lifelong buddies, his charisma practically oozing out of his perfectly styled hair and tailored button-downs. He had the kind of confidence that made people laugh at his jokes, even when they weren't funny, and he made an art of walking the fine line between charming and smug. I quickly learned that Brandon loved three things: bowling strikes, showing off, and talking about himself. For weeks, everything seemed normal. Madison's enthusiasm for the league felt like a nice change, as she'd been distant recently. I didn't think much of it, work stress, maybe, but as I spent more time with Brandon, I began noticing some inconsistencies. He loved bragging, particularly about his after-hours fun. According to Brandon, married women were his specialty because, as he so eloquently put it, they're bored and grateful for attention. His crude, winking remarks drew laughter from the other guys, but they made my stomach turn. It wasn't until one fateful night that Brandon's bragging hit a little too close to home. He'd been on a streak, both in bowling and in his storytelling, and he was on a roll about some mysterious woman he'd been seeing. He never named her, of course, but he dropped details. Blonde, works in marketing, killer smile, married but disconnected from her husband. My beer froze halfway to my lips. It sounded like Madison. Too much like Madison. I laughed along with the guys, but my mind was already racing. Surely it couldn't be her. There had to be a million blonde women in marketing. But doubt had already planted its seed. The next time I saw Madison, her smile, a smile I'd adored for 10 years, looked different. It felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. That was when I decided I needed to find out the truth. For better or worse, this bowling league was going to be more than just a hobby. It was going to be my battleground. Suspicion is a funny thing. It sneaks up on you quietly at first, like the faint whiff of something burning in the kitchen. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But once the idea takes root, it grows into something you can't ignore, no matter how much you try to dismiss it. That's exactly how I felt after hearing Brandon's story that night. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself I was being paranoid, insecure even. But every time I saw Madison after that night, the seed of doubt sprouted a little more. It was the little things that started to stand out. The way she seemed to spend extra time getting ready for work, how her phone was suddenly glued to her hand more than usual, and her increased mentions of late deadlines or last-minute office projects. To her credit, Madison never seemed like the type to cheat. She had always been straightforward, the kind of person who didn't hesitate to tell me exactly what was on her mind, whether I liked it or not. That's why I try to brush it off, at least for the first couple of weeks after Brandon's little performance. But as the bowling nights continued, so did his storytelling. Brandon was the type of guy who treated every lane in the bowling alley like his stage. He wasn't just bowling, he was performing. Every time he got a strike, he celebrated like he'd just won the lottery, and every missed shot came with some exaggerated joke or self-deprecating laugh. People loved him for it, or pretended to. I noticed that most of the women on the league giggled a little too enthusiastically at his antics, like they were auditioning for his attention. But none of that mattered to me until Brandon started dropping more clues. Another Thursday night, another beer in hand, and Brandon was in fine form again. This time, he was bragging about how his secret lady friend had baked him cookies last week, and how he was going to thank her properly with a dinner at some fancy downtown restaurant. The way he described her, her sense of humor, her blonde hair, her killer work ethic, made my chest tighten. I almost dropped my beer when he mentioned she worked on the marketing team for a tech company. Madison had been with her firm for years. I knew they had late nights and tight deadlines. That's how she explained all those times she came home tired or just a little too stressed. I never questioned it because why would I? But now it felt like I was the punchline to a joke I hadn't even realized I was part of. Still, I try to play it cool. Laughing along with Brandon and the rest of the guys wasn't easy, but I wasn't about to tip my hand. If there was something going on, and I wasn't ready to admit that there was, I needed proof. Doubt wasn't enough. I started watching Madison more closely. I felt like a stranger in my own home, paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. Did she linger on her phone longer than usual? Did she seem distracted when I asked her about her day? Was I imagining the way her voice changed when she mentioned Brandon? She wasn't hiding anything obvious, but that's the thing about trust. Once it's cracked, everything feels like evidence. Bowling night became less about fun and more about strategy. I started showing up early, hanging around Brandon and his group to see if he'd drop more breadcrumbs. He was careless with his stories, like a guy who assumed no one was really listening. Maybe no one else was, but I was. Every detail he shared became a puzzle piece, and I was determined to see the full picture. By the end of that month, I knew one thing for sure. Brandon's secret woman wasn't just a fling. He talked about her like she was the main event. He claimed she was smart, fun, and crazy in a good way. He even joked that her husband must be a boring guy, too distracted to notice what was going on. That was the first time I felt real anger bubbling under the surface. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was personal, and I was done sitting on the sidelines. I didn't want to believe that Madison could be involved with someone like Brandon, but I couldn't ignore the pieces falling into place. I decided I needed to do more than just listen. I needed to act. It's strange how ordinary things start to feel sinister when doubt creeps in. A hair tie left on the counter, an extra long stop at the gas station, or a text notification that lights up her phone just out of reach. None of it was outright proof, but together, it built an unsettling pattern I couldn't ignore. Thursday was always our bowling league night. But when Madison announced she wouldn't be joining this time, claiming she had to prep for a big presentation at work, something about her tone felt rehearsed. I kept my response neutral, a mix of casual agreement and curiosity. Inside, though, I was watching her closely, waiting for the slightest crack in her story. What caught my attention wasn't her tone or her rushed exit the next morning. It was the way she packed her gym bag, a bag she hadn't used in weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something symbolic in how meticulously she folded her clothes, like every item was part of some calculated performance. As Thursday evening rolled around, I made my way to the alley, scanning the faces of our league members as they arrived. Brandon was there, of course, in all his self-absorbed glory, tossing out jokes and laughing louder than anyone else. But Madison's absence lingered in my mind, even as I forced myself to focus on my game. Then Brandon did what Brandon always does, he bragged. This time, it was about his special Thursday plans with someone he called the Queen of Multitasking. I felt the words sink into my chest like a weight, pulling me deeper into the suspicion I'd been trying to suppress. After a few poorly aimed strikes and an equal number of poorly aimed beers, I excused myself early. I didn't have a plan, exactly, just a growing itch that told me I needed to know where Madison really was. I drove home first, trying to piece together her story in my head. Work prep, she'd said. That was believable enough, but the gym bag she packed earlier didn't fit. Madison wasn't one for late-night workouts. If she was working, why bring a change of clothes? When I pulled into our driveway, her car wasn't there. I checked her usual haunts, her office, the coffee shop where she claimed to work late, even the small co-working space she sometimes used. Nothing. As I drove through the neighborhood, I noticed the streetlights reflecting off something familiar, her car. It was parked in an unexpected place, the local park. Specifically, the lot near the walking trails. It wasn't a bad spot, technically. Lots of people use the trails at night, especially joggers. But Madison wasn't a jogger, and I knew those trails well. They weren't where you went to unwind. They were where you went to disappear. I parked nearby, careful not to draw attention, and waited. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but the longer I sat there, the more certain I became that something was wrong. About 20 minutes later, my patience was rewarded or punished, depending on how you see it. Brandon appeared, walking out of the shadows of the trailhead like he owned the night. He was laughing, his voice carrying easily through the quiet. And then I saw her. Madison followed behind him, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. She wasn't dressed for a jog. She wasn't even dressed for work. Her hair was down, her makeup flawless, and she wore a loose cardigan over a tank top that felt intentional. She laughed at something Brandon said, the kind of laugh that didn't belong to a woman coming from a late-night work meeting. I stayed frozen in my car, watching as they got into her car together and drove off. It hit me like a punch to the gut, not because they were together, but because this wasn't an affair of convenience. It wasn't some hotel cliché. They were in my town, my neighborhood, treating the streets I drove every day like their personal playground. I followed at a distance, my mind racing. This wasn't just betrayal. This was arrogance. And I was going to make sure they both felt the consequences. Title: When my wife's coworker bragged about after-hours fun, I decided to roll a strike of my own. Part 4. The shadows reveal the truth. I had always imagined betrayal would feel like a sudden impact, like a slap or a car crash, something that would knock the air out of my lungs. But as I followed Madison's car that night, what I felt instead was a slow, creeping numbness. The disbelief was there, but it wasn't alone. It brought anger and heartbreak along for the ride, settling into my chest like a stone I couldn't shake. Her taillights guided me through streets I knew all too well, streets that now felt foreign. The glowing red orbs disappeared briefly, but when I turned the corner, I saw them again, parked near a place I would have never suspected: the Thirsty Goose. The Thirsty Goose was one of those dimly lit bars that tried too hard to look rustic, all reclaimed wood and Edison bulbs. Madison had once joked about how tacky it was, saying it was where people went when they wanted to pretend they were cooler than they actually were. And yet here she was. I parked down the street and watched as they entered, her arm brushing against Brandon's as they shared a laugh. It wasn't the behavior of co-workers blowing off steam. It was intimate, practiced, comfortable in a way that stung more than I expected. I stepped out of my car and approached the bar on foot, keeping close to the shadows. From the window, I saw them settle into a booth in the back corner, far from prying eyes, but not far enough from mine. Brandon leaned in close, his hand resting on her thigh beneath the table. Madison didn't pull away. My phone was already in my hand before I realized what I was doing. The shutter sound was muted, but my heart pounded as if it might give me away. I snapped a few photos, my hands trembling. Each image felt like a nail in the coffin of our marriage, proof of what I already suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. I thought about storming inside, confronting them on the spot. It would have been dramatic, satisfying even, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear. Fear of confirming just how deep this betrayal went. Fear of seeing her face when she realized I knew. Or maybe it was strategy. I needed more. They stayed in the booth for a while, Brandon talking animatedly, while Madison smiled and nodded, her hand occasionally touching his arm. It was the kind of touch that used to be reserved for me, small, affectionate, and intimate. After finishing their drinks, they stood to leave, Brandon's hand sliding to the small of her back as they exited. I slipped behind a parked truck, watching them walk down the street toward what appeared to be a nearby event space. The building wasn't marked, just an unassuming brick structure with large windows that revealed a softly lit interior. As I got closer, I noticed the crowd, a mix of people dressed sharply, mingling with drinks in hand. A private party. Madison and Brandon walked in like they belonged, bypassing any sort of check-in. Through the window, I saw him introduce her to a group of people, his hand never leaving her back. It was then that I realized this wasn't just an affair, it was something bigger. Brandon wasn't hiding her. He was parading her. They moved deeper into the crowd, laughing and chatting like the perfect couple. Madison looked radiant, glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years. It hit me that she wasn't just having an affair. She was living an entirely separate life. A life where I didn't exist. I stayed outside, lurking in the shadows, snapping more photos through the window. At one point, Brandon leaned in close to whisper something into her ear. Whatever he said made her throw her head back in laughter. And then they kissed, Not the tentative kind of kiss you'd expect from two people sneaking around, but a bold, unapologetic one. The kind of kiss that said, "We don't care who sees us." I clenched my jaw, my nails digging into my palms. Still, I didn't move. I wanted to know where this night would lead, how far they'd go. They'd already crossed the line, but I had a sinking feeling there were more boundaries left to shatter. And I wasn't about to turn away before I saw it all. This wasn't just about catching them in the act. It was about understanding the full extent of what Madison had done, what she had chosen over the life we'd built together. And so, I stayed in the dark, my phone in hand, documenting every moment. I waited outside the venue, the cool night air biting at my skin, but doing nothing to chill the heat building in my chest. My heart raced, my fists clenched at my sides as I leaned against a lamppost, hidden just enough in the shadows to avoid being noticed. I wasn't sure how long I'd been standing there, replaying every moment of what I'd seen through the window. Each second only added to the storm inside me, and by the time I saw them leave, the calm facade I'd been clinging to had all but shattered. The door opened, and Madison stepped out first, her laughter ringing out into the night. Brandon followed, holding her jacket like some chivalrous act of gentlemanly pride. They looked relaxed, carefree, like two people with no regrets. I stepped forward, letting the streetlights cast their glow on my face. The sound of my boots on the pavement drew their attention, and the moment they saw me, their smiles froze. Madison's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Brandon tried to recover first, offering a casual smirk as if to deflect the tension. "Hey, man," he started, but he didn't get any further. "Don't you dare," I snapped, my voice low and sharp. "Don't you dare act like we're friends right now." Madison stammered something, an excuse, maybe, or an apology, but I didn't look at her. My focus was locked on Brandon, the man who had laughed about husbands like me, thinking he'd never face the consequences. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Do you think you can just waltz into my life and take what you want? Do you think I'm going to stand here and let you disrespect me like this?" Brandon raised his hands, palms out, trying to play it cool. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" I interrupted, stepping closer. "You already brought it." I didn't give him time to respond. The frustration, anger, and humiliation that had been simmering for weeks boiled over, and I grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward. His smirk disappeared, replaced by genuine fear as he realized I wasn't bluffing. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I hissed, my face inches from his. "Do you think you can just walk away from this without consequences?" Madison tried to intervene, placing a hand on my arm, but I shook her off without a glance. Her voice broke as she begged me to stop, but I wasn't hearing her anymore. Brandon muttered something about talking it out, but his words were cut short when I shoved him against the wall. Not hard enough to truly hurt him, but enough to make my point clear. "You've had plenty of time to talk," I growled. "Now it's my turn." He tried to wriggle free, but I wasn't done yet. My fists tightened, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I should hold back. Then I thought of the lies, the betrayal, and Brandon's smug grin as he told his stories at the bowling alley. The next thing I knew, my fist collided with his jaw. The sound wasn't loud, but the impact was satisfying. Brandon stumbled, his hand flying to his face as he let out a pained grunt. He looked more stunned than hurt, as if the idea of consequences was entirely foreign to him. I didn't stop there. Another swing landed squarely on his shoulder, forcing him off balance. He tripped over the curb and fell onto the pavement, his expensive shirt now smeared with dirt. "Get up," I snapped, my voice colder than the air around us. "Come on, aren't you the big man? The guy who gets whatever he wants?" Brandon stayed on the ground, his hands raised defensively. Okay, I'm sorry," he shouted, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." His words did little to calm me, but they were enough to make me pause. I looked down at him, my chest heaving, and realized he wasn't worth another punch. "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. "You don't get to decide that anymore." I stepped back, still glaring at him as he scrambled to his feet. Madison stood frozen, her face pale and tear-streaked. For a moment, I thought she might try to defend him, but she didn't say a word. Turning to her, I finally let the full weight of my anger settle. "This is what you chose, Madison," I said, my voice steady but cutting. "This is the man you thought was worth destroying our life for. I hope he was worth it." I knew that physical violence would not solve anything, but my emotions took over. I didn't wait for a response. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving them both standing there in the cold. My fists still ached from the confrontation, but for the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear. The betrayal wasn't over. There were still loose ends to tie, truths to uncover, and consequences to deliver. But for that moment, I had reclaimed something Brandon had taken without permission, my dignity. I didn't go home right away. My hands still trembled, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I sat in my car parked a few blocks away. The confrontation played over in my head, my words, my actions, the look on Brandon's face as he hit the ground. I didn't feel regret, not for him, but something heavier sat in my chest, the weight of what came next. Madison's betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was the erosion of a life I thought we'd built together. As much as I wanted to chalk it up to her poor choices, I couldn't ignore the pieces of myself that had contributed to the cracks in our foundation. But tonight wasn't the night for reflection. Tonight was about ending this. I waited for a while, watching the glow of the streetlights flicker against the pavement. Finally, I drove back to the house, the silence in the car almost suffocating. When I pulled into the driveway, her car wasn't there. Good. I walked inside and headed straight for the spare bedroom, where I'd started sleeping weeks ago. The distance between us had already become physical, even before the truth came out. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I reached into my pocket, pulling out the photos I'd printed earlier that day, the ones I'd taken of her and Brandon at the bar and at the park. Evidence, plain and undeniable. I wrote a note to her, short and to the point. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Don't come back." I left the note on the kitchen counter alongside the photos, each one a reminder of her betrayal. Then, I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began packing. Clothes, essentials, a few personal items. It didn't take long. The truth is, I realized I didn't need much to leave behind the weight of this house. As I loaded the bag into my car, a strange sense of calm washed over me. For weeks, I'd been consumed by anger, suspicion, and heartbreak. But now, standing there in the cool night air, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Madison didn't deserve another confrontation. She didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me break again. My absence would speak louder than any argument, any fight. Before leaving, I changed the locks. I knew she'd come back eventually, probably with apologies and excuses, but she wouldn't find me. By the time I hit the road, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the horizon in soft hues of orange and pink. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a need to go somewhere new, somewhere untouched by the memories of what I'd lost. A week later, I sat in a small coffee shop in a coastal town I'd never been to before. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, but I ignored them all. Madison's name appeared repeatedly, but I couldn't bring myself to read her words. I didn't need to. Through mutual friends, I learned that Brandon had been fired after their affair became public knowledge. Apparently, someone had forwarded the photos to his boss. A bold move, but I wasn't complaining. Madison had been reassigned to a smaller project team at work, her reputation tarnished, but not entirely destroyed. I wondered if she'd try to rebuild her life with the same energy she'd spent destroying mine. As for me, I started over. Slowly, carefully. I didn't rush into anything, not relationships, not jobs, not even conversations with strangers. I spent time with myself, figuring out who I was without the shadow of Madison hanging over me. Months later, I received a final email from her. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and she didn't beg me to come back. Instead, it was a quiet acknowledgement of the damage she'd done. "You didn't deserve what I did to you. I hope you find the happiness I couldn't give you. I am sorry." It wasn't closure. Not entirely, but it was enough to finally let go. Now, as I sit on a quiet beach watching the waves roll in, I feel the sting of the past less sharply. It's still there, a scar, a reminder, but it no longer controls me. The life I'd built with Madison is gone, but the life I'm building now? It's mine, free from lies, free from betrayal. Sometimes the best strike isn't the one that knocks everything down. It's the one that sets you free.